February 10th, 1969. Henry, there's someone here to see you, Catherine Bowman called to her son after she had opened the front door. Go on upstairs, she told the visitor. His room's on the right. Richard Gaines quickly made his way to Henry Bowman's bedroom. He found Henry sitting at a wide desk. Above it on the wall was a framed photo of a green and white biplane about 100 feet off the ground, pointed almost straight down and obviously about to crash. Henry had several texts open on the desk and was bent over a piece of graph paper, making fine marks on it. He did not raise his head, but held up a finger, indicating that his visitors should wait silently for a moment. Richard did not know it, but Henry was calculating extended trajectory curves for his heart-barreled 224 Clark varmint rifle based on the range results he had achieved the day before at 1, 2, and 300 yards. Sorry, my head was full of numbers I didn't want to lose. He was startled to see Dick Gaines standing in the doorway. Come on in. The older boy closed the door behind him and got to the point. Look, I've only got 1,100 right now. That's all I could get in 2 days, but it's in cash. And I'll have the rest before you go in to take the test. Henry shook his head. It's almost 8:30, he said, nodding towards the clock on the wall. I said by 6. Jesus, what's 2 hours? Richard Gaines pleaded. Look, you don't have to do the $200 deal, okay? He offered. I know you'll do great. Just take the test for me, okay? Henry shook his head. Have I wandered into the twilight zone? I've got to come up with something that'll get rid of this moron. He smiled sadly and said, You don't understand. After 6, it was the next guy in line's turn. He's already come by with the money, so I've been hired. And no matter what kind of IDs you can come up with, there's no way I can be 2 people at the same time. Sorry. Richard Gaines looked crestfallen. He nodded his head and turned to leave. Henry Bowman opened his mouth as Richard Gaines walked out the door, then shut it when he realized he had nothing more to say. Henry didn't go back to the trajectory tables that night. Some vague beliefs he had instinctively held had just been magnified 100-fold in his mind. It would be years before he would be able to put them into words, but they had already taken deep root. Always deal from a position of strength. When opportunity presents itself, seize it. Take control of a situation and others will follow you even when it is not in their best interest to do so. Political power begets corruption. But the most important lesson was the one Henry had already learned from the events of his canoe trip the previous summer. Know when to walk away. June 1st, 1969. He's magnificent, but I'm afraid as soon as we stalk closer he'll be in the woods. The wind isn't in our faces and might change. Best to find another herd rather than waste time on this one. Raymond Johnson lowered his binoculars. By the time we do that, it'll be dark. I don't mind quitting for the day, but let me think about this for just a minute, Max Collins replied. His eyes scanned the area around where they stood. Not a fucking thing I could use for a rest around here. He looked at Raymond and at the 2 trackers that were with him. Roll up a couple shirts still wouldn't be but 3 inches high, and that's not enough to keep the grip cap out of the dirt. His eyes came to rest on a patch of ground that was very slightly higher than the surrounding area. That might get me above the weeds. Max Collins slid his left arm through the military sling and tightened it around his upper bicep as he knee-walked to the place he had picked out. The guide saw what he was doing and spoke up immediately. Ah, Max, that's a 400-yard shot, and I don't think... Closer to 450, Collins interrupted as he went from a kneeling position to one flat on his stomach. Unless the one is normal size and all the others are stunted. Johnson opened his mouth to say something, then shut it. Max had made a perfect shot on a warthog that morning. Ray was not about to insult a client on the first day of his safari. The trackers could use some night practice anyway. The big man stared out at the distant herd of greater kudu, looking for clues as to the speed of the wind. Almost none, this late. Just a kiss. From the left, he decided with satisfaction. Then Collins worked himself into the same prone position he had used to place third in the Wimbledon Cup 1000 to yard match in the late 30s. His feet were spread, and his spine, when viewed from above, made a 25-degree angle with the axis of the rifle barrel. Colin's elbows pressed into the dry earth, supporting his upper body, and the sling bit into his left arm as the tension on it increased. The two trackers looked at Ray Johnson and scowled. The professional hunter did not normally let anyone take such a long shot, especially when the game was standing right next to the woods, and certainly not a half hour before dusk. Tracking a wounded animal in the dark was much harder, and their employer did not believe in letting injured game get away and take days to die. They looked at each other and resigned themselves to being up the entire night. The gray animal with the spiral horns that faced the four men was Africa's version of a bull elk. The kudu did not come close to filling the scope's field of view at that long a distance, but Max Collins could see that he was indeed a huge example of the species. The rifleman put the crosshairs at a spot he judged to be 32 inches above and 6 inches to the left of the kudu's heart, took a deep breath, let part of it out, and began to squeeze the trigger. The kudu took a step and started turning. It began to walk towards the woods. Shit! Collins swore silently. Can't shoot at moving game at this range. He relaxed his trigger finger as he tracked the animal, willing the bull to stop for a moment. As if obeying his command, the big male kudu quit walking and sniffed the air. The kudu was now facing away at a quartering angle, and a straight line from the muzzle of Collins Model 70 would traverse over 3 feet of abdominal muscle before reaching the kudu's heart or lungs. Max Collins moved the crosshairs to a spot almost 3 feet over the kudu's back, then changed his mind spines too small for this range, too easy to miss altogether, and just tear up the muscle. The kid said more than 4 feet time to see if he really knows what the fuck he is talking about. Max altered his aim so that the crosshairs rested on a point slightly above the kudu's back and a foot in front of the animal's right hip. It was what Elmer Keith referred to as a raking shot through the boiler room, and could be taken, especially on an animal as large as a greater kudu, only if the rifle and ammunition being used gave truly outstanding penetration. Typical hunting rifles, firing expanding bullets normally were good for between 12 and 18 inches of penetration on thin-skinned game. The crosshairs were describing a regular pattern as they moved within an imaginary 6-inch area containing Collins' aiming point. The rifleman got in sync with the movement, and the trigger broke just as. The crosshairs passed through the spot Collins had selected. Perfect let off, he thought, as the muzzle blast rang out across the plain. Miss, Ray said the bull was just standing there. No, Ray here, Banda, the lead tracker, was staring through the binoculars, and had seen dust fly from the hide in front of the kudu's right haunch. He bent over and jabbed his index finger at the corresponding spot on his own torso. To illustrate the tracker was grinning, he knew what was coming. The other animals in the herd began moving towards the trees when the sound of the shot reached them, but the big bull stood utterly still. 6 seconds later, he collapsed in a heap. Heart shot, Max said as he got to his feet. Either that or he died of fright. The guide, the client, and the two trackers started the quarter-mile walk to where the kudu lay. All 4 of them were smiling. So, was the first day up to expectations? Ray and Max were relaxing by the campfire. Max was drinking scotch. The younger man preferred gin. Damn, but I've never seen this much game, Max said with feeling. And I about shit when I saw that lion take down that buffalo, for Christ's sake. That morning, they had seen a lion tear the throat from a Cape buffalo and hang on until it bled out. That was unusual for me too, Ray admitted. Usually they won't try it unless there are a pair that can attack at the same time. The one today must have been hungry. As I point out to everyone who comes here for the first time, nothing in Africa dies of old age. He took a sip of his drink and stared into the glowing fire. I'm still thinking about the shot you made on that kudu 440 steps, through the paunch, and stopping just under the skin of the chest. Max smiled, been practicing a little. I've had other clients use the 338 Winchester, but nobody got penetration like you did with soft points 4.5 feet. Got to give my nephew credit for that. He's become the ballistician in the family. He thought I should bring a 375 Ackley, but I wanted a factory caliber for my plains rifle, just in case my ammo got lost and I had to buy some. I was going to load up some solids for my 338 for big stuff like Elan, but he talked me out of it. Max was referring to ammunition loaded with bullets that had no lead exposed and did not deform at all on impact. Such projectiles penetrated much more deeply than expanding bullets. This was necessary on large game such as the eland, which weighed over a ton. Henry loaded the stuff I brought on this trip. Max slid a round out of his cartridge belt and handed it to Ray for his inspection. That's a 275-gram spear, he explained as Ray examined the round, referring to the weight and manufacture of the copper and lead bullet projecting from the neck of the cartridge case. Elmer Keith sworn by him for years. Max added Keith was the 70-year-old former outfitter and firearms authority from Salmon, Idaho. Ray Johnson nodded. Keith was well known to all serious hunters and guides. When Ray had lived in Pitkin County, he had corresponded with Keith on several occasions. Henry said the latest batch of 275 feet out of the factory would blow up. Said Spear got a bunch of complaints from deer hunters who didn't like them whistling through a muley like shit through a goose. And they softened the core, hardened the gilding metal, and scored the inside of the jacket. If you can believe that Henry hunted up a bunch of different lot numbers, sectioned and tested them all, and said this batch was good for more than 4 feet on game. Your nephew is a hunter, then? Ray asked. Max Collins laughed at this question and took another sip of his scotch. Henry's dying to get over here. He shoots a 375 Ackley like a varmint rifle. Must have put 5,000-6,000 rounds through that thing by this time. Got a Rigby 577 double he's damn good with too, and he's been looking for a 4-bore for 10 years now. But to answer your question, other than a few groundhogs he's potted out in the country, Henry's never been hunting. He'd rather shoot 10 crows in an afternoon than sit in a tree stand all weekend and wait for a deer to walk by. When he promised me I'd get more than 4 feet penetration, I figured he'd tried the ammo out on wet newspapers or old phone books or something. Collins laughed harder at the memory. He was really fired up. I was going to Africa, though. Turned out and here Max had to get himself collected before he could continue. He conned some guy at the slaughterhouse into letting him paste a couple of their steers, gave the guy a bottle of whiskey to go on break so Henry could autopsy him. Good Lord, Max, Ray said as he laughed along with the older man. You should have brought him along. I wish all my clients who'd never been hunting were like that. I would have, but he's still in school right now. Henry's 16. Max's face lit up as he remembered something else. Henry got the whiskey from my sister's liquor cabinet because the store wouldn't sell him any and had to get me to go buy another bottle to replace it before his mother found out. You did, I hope? Shit, I ran out and bought him a case, told him to work up some good Cape Buffalo loads for my 458. Ray Johnson found this comment uproariously funny, despite it being only the first day of a 3-week safari. He decided that his earlier assessment of the man had been dead on. Max Collins was the best client he had ever had in his 6 years working as a professional hunter. June 12th, 1969. The 3 big bulls were by themselves, and since the wind was blowing away from them, they were unaware that Ray, Max, and the 2 trackers were nearby. They were all large, but the bull in front was definitely the biggest. 45 inches at least, Raymond thought. 17, maybe 1,800 pounds. Max Collins was carrying his dangerous game rifle, a custom. 450 Ashers built on a Czech Brno ZKK 602 action. The Brno action was, in Max's opinion, the best of the Magnum Mausers. Kurt Benke had fitted the barrel and milled the trigger guard an oversized magazine that held 5 rounds. He had also reversed the operation of the safety, no simple task, so that it functioned in the same direction, forward 4 off, as the rifles made in every country other than Czechoslovakia. Henry and Walter Bowman had made the stock to fit their big relative. The 450 Ashers cartridge was made from a straightened 375 H&H case. It was basically a lengthened 458 Winchester that held more powder and could therefore be loaded to more powerful levels. The chamber was cut so that lower powered .38 factory ammo could be used in a pinch, with only a slight loss in accuracy. Take him, Raymond whispered. He didn't need to say which one. Collins threw the big rifle to his cheek and squeezed the trigger as soon as the front sight settled on the Cape Buffalo's shoulder. The muzzle blast of the 450 Ashurst made the 4 men's ears ring, and the buffalo dropped as if struck by a bolt of lightning. At 16 yards, Collins had put his shot within a quarter inch of where he was aiming, which was on the point of the animal's shoulder. The 500-grain steel-jacketed solid bullet had struck the buffalo at 2,460 feet per second, concentrating over 6,700 foot-pounds of energy onto an area smaller than a dime. Henry had correctly predicted exactly what would happen if Max were to get a broadside shot at a Cape buffalo. The 500-grain Winchester solid was designed to go straight and maintain its shape no matter what it struck. It shattered the buffalo's near shoulder, clipped the top of its heart, and smashed its off shoulder in a space of about 3 milliseconds. No four-legged creature can remain standing with both shoulders shattered, and this one was no exception. There was another thing that Henry had predicted, but Max would not remember the boy's warning until several minutes later. A lot was going to happen before then. Max Collins racked the bolt of the Czech Mauser without dropping the rifle's butt from his shoulder, ejected the fired case, and chambered a new round before the dust had settled around the carcass of the 1,750-pound animal. Max knew that his bullet had done exactly what he had wanted, and that the buffalo he had shot was not a danger to them, but he did not lower his rifle. There were 2 other bulls less than 50 feet away, and Cape buffalo were known to charge at almost any time. They were especially known to charge when wounded, and that is exactly what the bull farthest from the 4 men did. This second bull, which weighed a mere 1,630 pounds, lowered his nose and headed straight at Max Collins. A charging Cape buffalo at less than 50 feet presents a very challenging problem, particularly if the animal's head is lowered. A heart shot, where the animal will die within 5 or 10 seconds, is not good enough. Man and lion both have all too often been killed by a dying Cape buffalo in the last few seconds of its life. In order to survive a charge, the hunter must not only kill the animal, but make it collapse before it gets to him. Shoulder and spine shots do this, but are not possible from the front. The only shot that is certain to drop a charging buffalo instantly is one to the brain. This poses a problem in that the animal's thick horn bosses cover much of the buffalo's skull and act as a very effective form of armor against any attempted brain shots. When the gold bead of the 45-0's front sight landed on the charging bull's head, Max Collins pulled the trigger and worked the bolt as the gun rose in recoil. He concentrated on his shooting and not on what might happen to him in the next few seconds. Max's shot on the charging bull was 2 inches higher and 1.25 inches left of where it should have been. It struck 1 over 4 inches above the corner of the sloping horn boss just left of center. The round nose of the Winchester bullet was deflected several degrees by the dense horn material. The bullet plowed through the horn boss on an angled path, glanced off the skull, cracking it slightly, and howled off over the Angolan countryside. In doing this, the impact of the bullet blew a baseball-sized chunk of horn material and a small amount of buffalo hide 50 feet in the air. It also made the bull considerably angrier in the process. The Cape buffalo kept coming. Ray Johnson stepped to the side as he raised his 600 Nitro Holland, and Holland flicked off the safety and prepared to try to stop the charge. Max Collins did not notice his guide's actions. He thought of nothing except working the bolt of his rifle smoothly, putting the front sight on the center of the buffalo's skull, and squeezing the trigger. His next shot on the charging beast was 1 inch lower than the last one. With the chunk of horn gone, the steel-jacketed slug bored right into the brain, deflected off the inside of the skull, and traveled down the center of the animal's spinal column for a distance of almost 3 feet. The buffalo fell on its chest and skidded to a stop less than 10 feet in front of Collins, who was racking the 450's bolt for yet another shot. The big buff was dead. It had died before its chin hit the ground, its brain destroyed, and its spine cored by the steel-jacketed slug. Max looked over at Raymond, who lowered his 600 Nitro and engaged the safety. "Nice double, Max," Ray said with a grin. Max nodded, but didn't say anything right away. He was feeling just a little lightheaded. "Thanks for holding off," he said finally. "It felt good to drop that second one without any help." Raymond smiled. He had known that Max would want to stop the charge himself. The 2 men made jokes and laughed in relief after the charge, and then the guide noticed something. "I think I see why he charged, Max. Look." Ray was indicating the side of the dead buffalo's body, and Collins had to walk several yards to his right to see what the man was pointing at. 2 feet behind the shoulder was a fingernail-sized hole with a trickle of blood running out of it. Banda, the lead tracker, stepped over to the buffalo and inserted the thin blade of a skinning knife into the hole. The knife stopped after 3 inches of it had disappeared. "Your shot on the first one," Ray explained, broke both shoulders, exited, and went a couple inches into the bull standing behind him. "Pissed him off, I'd say." "I'll be a son of a bitch," Collins said. "My nephew told me that might happen, and I told him he was crazy." "I've seen it before with a 378 Weatherby," Ray Johnson admitted, "but never with a .45 caliber rifle. We'll make sure your next one doesn't have anything standing around behind it." Max Collins shook his head and laughed as he watched the trackers roll the buffalo on its side and prepare to gut it. "Damn, but it's good to be alive." The men were back in camp, eating a late dinner that the camp cook had prepared and reliving the excitement of the afternoon, when Max suddenly thought of something. He put down his fork, finished chewing, and looked at Ray Johnson. "You know, that little bastard even told me he had a cure for it. But I didn't take him seriously." "What's that, Max?" "Overpenetration with solids in the 450. He loaded up some ammo for me in case I had that problem, and I thought he was kidding." "Soft points?" "No, we both thought those might not reach the second shoulder. Let me show you." Max Collins went to his tent and retrieved his ammo bag. He dug down in the bottom, found the ammo box he was looking for, and brought it back to the table. Ray took it from him and pulled off the lid. Inside were 2,450 Ashurst cartridges, but the 500-grain steel-jacketed solids had been seated backwards into the brass cases. Instead of a rounded nose, the striking end of the bullet was completely flat and full diameter. "They're backwards!" Raymond exclaimed. "I thought it was a joke, but he insisted I bring them with me. He said he'd found some article where John Bummiller tried it on elephant, and they killed better that way. Henry altered the feed ramp and rethroated my barrel for base first bullets, and he says his crazy load shoots to the same point of aim at 50 yards. Said they bust up the shoulder bones on the slaughterhouse bulls better, too." "I have never heard of doing that, but John Bummiller is a man I would listen to." Bummiller was a Montana barrel maker who had won Montana's version of the Wimbledon Cup 1000 to yard match in both 1937 and 1938. He was an avid experimenter with a fondness for large calibers who had first gone to Africa when he was in his 70s. Bummiller had taken a liking to Africa and gone on to work game control there, shooting hundreds of head of dangerous game while in his 80s. Henry Bowman corresponded with him regularly. 20 years later, flat-pointed, thick-jacketed, 458 projectiles would be made by Jack Carter's Trophy Bonded Bullets Company. Trophy Bonded Sledgehammer Solid would be considered by many African hunters to be the best slug ever made for Cape Buffalo. In 1969, however, the only shooters loading anything like it were an old Montana barrel maker and a 16-year-old from Missouri who liked to shoot big guns. "I think I'll load these crazy-looking things in my 450 tomorrow when we go out," Max said, examining one of the cartridges Henry had made for him. "Tell me more about this nephew of yours, Max," Ray said as he motioned for one of the camp crew to refill his drink. "I have a sneaky feeling you've only given me the tip of the iceberg." July 10th, 1969. 800 or a little bit more, Alan Kane said after turning the thumb wheel to bring the halves of the split image into alignment. "Let's see if the site subcontractor knew what he was doing," Henry Bowman replied with a grin. "And the guys at Lake City Arsenal?" Kane laughed as he looked up from the tripod-mounted 80-centimeter bar and Stroud rangefinder. Henry slid the rear sight of the 1945 era New England Westinghouse manufactured Browning automatic rifle to its 800-yard setting, checked to see that the bore was clear, made sure the wing nuts on the bipod were tight, and lay down behind the weapon. He put in his earplugs, snapped a full 20-round magazine into place, made sure the rate of fire selector was on slow, and pulled the butt tightly against his shoulder. He put the front sight on the rock outcropping jutting out from the distant mountainside and squeezed the trigger. 3 blasts chugged out of the 20-pound weapon, and 3 red streaks curved out over the valley and disappeared into the hillside a half-mile away. "Windage is good. You're about 8, maybe 10 feet low," Kane offered, peering through the huge 20-power Japanese battleship binoculars that were also mounted on a tripod. Shoot some more. Henry put 5 more bursts into the distant mountainside with very similar results. Tracers get lighter as they burn, probably drop more. Yeah, but you never know. Ball or AP might shoot somewhere else entirely. We'll find out after I shoot some more tracers. He adjusted his rear sight, then reached into the ammo can for another loaded magazine. He fired another burst, and the tracers bounced off the distant rock at unpredictable angles, burning out in midair as they tumbled. Henry Bowman loved tracer ammo. He fired 13 more 20-round magazines before standing up. "Your turn," he said cheerfully as he picked up the 15 empty magazines and stacked them neatly on end in the 50 caliber ammo can. "Now for the good stuff," Alan Kane announced as he lifted another 50 cal can off the tailgate of the truck, blue tip. Kane lay down behind the automatic rifle and adjusted the gun's position. He was careful not to touch the barrel, which was now at a temperature of over 700 degrees. He made sure the bolt was retracted and snapped a loaded magazine of .30-06 ammunition into the bottom of the gun's receiver. Tracer ammunition enabled belt-fed machine gun shooters to see where their shots were going, especially at night. Standard military practice called for every 5th round in the belt to be a tracer, and the other 4 to be armor-piercing rounds whose bullets were constructed with pointed, hardened, tungsten alloy cores for penetrating steel armor plate. Both tracer and armor-piercing. Caliber ammo were common on the surplus market. AP was easily recognized by the black paint on the tip of the bullet. Tracers were painted red or orange. During the Second World War, the United States had developed a .30 caliber incendiary round and had started loading it in 1943. Incendiary ammunition explodes with a flash when it hits its target and is most useful for igniting the fuel tanks of enemy aircraft. U.S. incendiary ammo is characterized by blue paint on the tip. Before the end of 1943, the U.S. military had realized that since A, none of their fighter aircraft carried caliber machine guns, and B, the only time a .30 caliber gun was used in an anti-aircraft capacity was by utter coincidence there was little use for .30 caliber incendiary ammunition, and they stopped making it. Production of 50 caliber incendiary and to an even greater degree silver-tipped armor-piercing incendiary was summarily increased. Blue-tipped .30 caliber, however, was only found with the 43 head stamp and was harder to come by. Blue tip was Henry and Alan's favorite. Alan Kane put the rear sight back on the 800-yard setting, took aim, and squeezed off a 3-round burst. A little over a second later, 3 bright white flashes appeared at the base of the rock outcropping. Were easily visible even in the bright sunlight. "Good windage. You're right at the base of the rocks. Nice tight group, too. Looked like all 3 were in about 5 feet. That's the bar for you." Alan Kane spent the next 20 minutes putting 3-shot bursts of .30-06 incendiary into the distant rocks, then picked up his Garand and took some long-range shots from the standing position with the World War II semi-auto. While Alan Kane was doing this, Henry Bowman got out his .83-8 44 Magnum, braced himself against the rear tire of Alan's truck, and did some half-mile 6-gun shooting. It took him 5 shots to determine the right amount of front sight to hold up to hit the Volkswagen-sized boulder a half-mile away. The sun was behind them, and Henry could easily spot the puffs of rock dust that flew up when the big cast slugs hit. After getting his sight picture down pat, Henry switched to a smaller rock, one about the size of an overstuffed armchair. He found that he could hit it 3 to 4 shots out of every cylinder. Got to ration myself, he realized, when he saw how many fired cases had piled up already. Between us, we've only got maybe 15,000 rounds of 44 seconds, and that has to last 3 weeks. He closed the lid on the ammo can, packed his empties in a canvas bag, and stood up. Henry stowed the ammo can and fired brass in a side compartment of the truck's camper top and went back to the giant binoculars to study the exposed rocks around him. He and Alan were on a very large section of federal land in the central part of Idaho, and the rock formations were different from those that Henry was used to seeing in Missouri. The Midwest was comprised of sedimentary deposits, which were evident along the river and anywhere on any interstate where the highway cut through a hill. Idaho had many more igneous formations, and Henry realized he was unconsciously classifying the geologic structures as he saw them. Henry enjoyed figuring things out, and he was just beginning to discover that geology offered limitless opportunities in that area. "What?" Henry asked when he realized Alan Kane had said something to him. "I said let's pack up and head towards the Possumoroy Valley, see if Elmer was pulling our leg when he told us this was the big year in the Jack cycle." "Sounds good to me." Henry began to help Alan gather up their equipment, leaving the Browning until last to give it more time to cool. When they got in the cab of the truck and headed back down the mountain, the bar was stowed in a felt-lined canvas drop case. Its barrel was still too hot to touch. July 15th, 1969. "How far out do you want them?" Henry asked nervously. "Whatever you think'd make it interesting." Great, Henry thought, put it all on me. He decided to spread the targets out over various ranges. 100 paces ought to do it for the close ones. I can hit those at least. He picked up the paper sack and started walking. Alan and Henry were 30 miles outside Salmon, Idaho. Elmer Keith was with them. When Keith had heard Alan Kane was coming to shoot jackrabbits, he had agreed to take an afternoon off from writing and do some long-range shooting with the Indiana ballistician and his young friend from Missouri. Alan and Henry had picked up the 70-year-old gunwriter at his house in Salmon, and Keith had directed Alan to a suitable spot outside the small town. Henry Bowman was nervous. Elmer Keith had been shooting revolvers for over 60 years, and he had studied and mastered many of Ed McGivern's aerial shooting feats 40 years before. He was also the man who had persuaded Smith & Wesson to produce the .44 Magnum, and his book Six Guns, written when Henry was 3 years old, was the definitive work on using the revolver for hunting and defense. An entire chapter of the book was devoted to shooting revolvers at ranges up to a half mile. Henry Bowman did not want to embarrass himself in front of Elmer Keith. In the paper sack Henry carried were 24 2-diameter sticks of 80% strength ditching dynamite. Alan had bought 4 cases of it at a truck depot in Mackay on the drive north to Salmon. They had wrapped each stick with a piece of typing paper held on with tape, and then given it a quick coat of fluorescent orange paint from a spray can for better visibility. Henry was walking out across the rocks and sagebrush to put the dynamite out at various ranges for the 3 of them to shoot at. When Henry had counted off 70 paces, he got nervous. "Be pretty lame if I can't hit any of them. Better stick a few close in." He laid down 3 sticks several yards apart, making sure they could be seen from where Alan and Elmer were standing, and then kept walking. When Elmer Keith saw this, he raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Henry put 9 sticks 100 paces out, 6 at 150, and the final 6 at what he judged was 200 yards. When he got back to his 2 companions, the older man was smiling. 70, 100, 150, and 200, Henry announced. "Why'd you stick those first 3 so close in?" Kane demanded. "So you could show us some hip shooting," Henry shot back. The old man laughed. "Now this ought to split the real gun hands out from the ones should do their shootin' across a table," Keith said around the side of his cigar. He was obviously amused. He tipped back the large 5x beaver Stetson that had been his trademark for over 40 years and looked closely at Henry. "Go on," he said, nodding. Wonderful, Henry thought. Like we couldn't all shoot at the same time and make it a little less embarrassing. He slipped his earplugs in and went to the tailgate of the truck. He retrieved a .50 caliber can full of what he considered his match ammo. It had been loaded using once-fired cases and bullets Henry had cast out of the alloy he had found to be most accurate in S and W revolvers. The bullet design was the Hensley & Gibbs 503rd, cast using the matched pair of molds his father had given him 5 years before, lubricated with a 50% Alox 50% beeswax mixture, and sized in straight-through star dies. Elmer Keith had designed the bullet in the late 20s. They shot well at all distances. Henry Bowman put the ammo can at his feet and drew the 83/8 in frame from the cross-draw holster. He had sighted that particular gun to shoot 3 inches high at 100 yards. He loaded the cylinder, pulled the big 6-gun into the braced, 2-handed position, and cocked the hammer. The orange targets at the 150-step range were small, but not as hard to see as Henry had feared when he had put them out there. He put the front sight on the orange speck and made sure the top of the rear blade was even with the top of the gold insert in the front ramp. Henry increased the pressure of his right index
finger
and squeezed the final few ounces just as the front sight obscured the distant orange target. The big smith bucked in recoil. "Just over the top," Alan Kane said immediately. "I think if you'd been a couple inches lower, you'd have hit it." Henry nodded and eared back the hammer for another try. This time he willed the trigger to break just before the front sight covered the orange dot in the distance. Immediately following the blast of the Magnum revolver came the distant, satisfying boom of the ditching dynamite, detonated by the impact of the 250-grain flat-nosed slug. A 10-foot cloud of dust appeared and began to settle at the spot where the charge had been. Without hesitating, Henry cocked the hammer again and loosed another round at the next charge set at the same distance. It exploded as well. Henry missed with his fourth shot, again going a bit high. He connected with his fifth, then switched to the 200-yard targets for the last round in his cylinder. "Gonna try 200, he announced. He held up about a 16th of an inch of the front sight blade, put the target on top of it, and willed the gun to fire. "Less than a foot right," Elmer Keith announced as Henry lowered his gun, opened the cylinder, and ejected the spent cases into his ammo pouch. "AI," Keith said, addressing the man from Indiana. "I guess young Henry here won't be calling me a liar about 6 guns at long range." Kane laughed, and Henry smiled at the compliment. "Time to see if I've still got my eyesight," Keith announced, and drew a 4-barreled Smith & Wesson from an inside-the-pants holster on his right hip. It was identical to Henry's gun, except for the shorter barrel and the smaller grips, which were inlaid on each side with an eagle medallion. Keith exploded the 3 remaining 100-yard charges with 4 shots, missed one at 150 yards, then connected with his last round. Henry noticed that Keith fired all 6 rounds in about half the time that he himself had taken. "He is good," Henry thought. "Leave me the easy ones and the impossible ones, huh?" Alan Kane said in mock indignation. "We've got plenty of dynamite," Henry said cheerfully. The 3 shooters had spent the rest of the afternoon shooting a variety of long-range and aerial targets. Henry Bowman was especially impressed with what Alan Kane and Elmer Keith could each do with 2 revolvers, fired from the hip simultaneously. Keith, in turn, was surprised at Henry's skill on aerial targets, especially with the 20-pound bar. Henry shook the man's hand once again as they dropped him off at his house. "Thanks for taking the time to see us today, Elmer," Henry said. Keith smiled. "You got the right idea with that. 375 Ackley of yours, son," he declared as he climbed out of the truck. "No point in spending all your time practicing with a pest rifle like that 7mm Remington if you're ever going to hunt game animals." He turned and walked towards his house. Alan Kane waited until he had entered the front door, then accelerated away from the curb. "He's better than I am with a revolver," Henry decided. "I need to practice more." August 13th, 1969. "If you're looking for a department that will teach Marxism, I'd advise you to consider another school." "Pardon me?" Henry said. He thought he had heard the man correctly, but after listening to some of the economics professors at other liberal arts schools boast of the progressive courses their departments offered, he was startled by the man's blunt declaration. Henry Bowman was in the final stages of that ritual common to prep school students in the summer preceding their senior year, the college visiting trip. In late June, Henry had removed the rear seat and control stick from his clipped-wing 140-horsepower Cub and bolted a cover over the hole in the floor where the stick had been. He had packed camping gear, clothes, a folding bike, his 5 Smith & Wesson, and 3,000 rounds of ammunition behind the front seat, and headed east. Henry had spent the last 3 weeks flying around New England, landing at local airports and bicycling to various schools. Most New England colleges had small airports nearby, and all had quoted him reasonable hangar rates if he decided to base his plane there during the school year. Lafleur Airport was only 4 miles from Amherst College, and the people there had been very hospitable. Airport owners tended to admire acrobatic pilots, particularly ones who camped out of their airplanes. This department teaches economics based on the principles of free market capitalism, and no one currently on our faculty advocates anything else. Professor Nelson was about 65, had white hair, and was slightly hard of hearing. His teeth were white and straight, and he showed a lot of them when he spoke. He was very outspoken, which Henry could see, and he had no patience for the students who attempted to take over classes in the 5-college area of the Pioneer Valley. This had happened often the previous year, under the guise of war protest. Professor Nelson had no quarrel with those who opposed the war. He was no fan of it himself. He had noticed, however, that all protest efforts took place during daytime hours of weekdays and disappeared on weekends and vacation days. It seemed crazy to the professor that a student who was paying thousands of dollars to attend college would barricade the door to a classroom and hold the class hostage to a free-form rap session about the war instead of demanding that the professor deliver every bit of his expensive expertise to the class. The only rational reason Nelson could accept was one he had overheard a demonstration leader tell another young man the previous spring, "The hell with whether you believe this shit or not, this is the best way to get good-looking rich chicks to fuck you I've ever found." James Nelson was one of the longest-tenured professors at Amherst College, and was a nationally recognized expert on railroad regulation. As such, he was keenly aware of the problems created when policy planners attempted to unload their own socialist agendas onto dynamic, creative people powerfully motivated by economic self-interest. Professor Nelson smiled at Henry Bowman and added, "I tell you this now so you won't feel misled if you matriculate here a year from now. Maybe you'll want to reconsider your choice of colleges." Henry Bowman liked this man, even though he'd only known him for 20 minutes. "He kind of reminds me of Elmer Keith," Henry thought. That is, if Elmer Keith had lived in an eastern college town, worn a suit, and taught economics for the last 40 years instead of living in Idaho, riding horses, guiding hunting parties, and shooting guns too. Or 3 hours a day. On the other hand, Henry countered, what you've said may make me want to tear up my applications to Hampshire, Antioch, and Williams, and bribe the dean of admissions here to make sure I get in. Nelson chuckled at this. Nobody who applied to Amherst College even considered attending any of the 3 schools Henry had just named. "Thank you for taking the time to talk to me," Henry said, becoming serious again. "I've read the descriptions in the course catalog of what this department offers. There are a lot of classes I'd like to take here." "We do a fair job," Nelson replied. Henry stood to leave. "Can you aim me towards the geology building?" he asked. Nelson pointed with his cane out the window. "Corner of the quad, 200 yards. Make sure you go to the geology museum too. It's the small building right next to the science center." "Thanks, I'll do that." Henry left the man's office and found the stairwell. Nelson smiled to himself as Henry left. He liked young people in general, and the one he had just met was no exception. If anything, James Nelson had understated the Amherst College Econ Department's aversion to statist intervention and socialist economic policies. 8 years later, a student group devoted to campus humor and practical jokes would print up and distribute an official-looking notice of recent additions to the spring course catalog. One of the entries would ostensibly be taught by the chairman of the economics department and was described thus: Econ 32 Constructive Alternatives to Capitalism. Professor Kohler, required for major, room 312 Converse Hall, 12 noon minus 12, 05 first Wednesday of every month. James Nelson would find this very amusing. It was the geology museum that did it, Henry Bowman reflected as he stretched out on the closed cell foam mattress, pulled his sleeping bag loosely over his legs, and reflected on what he was sure was his final choice of school. He had entered the nondescript brick building and almost immediately been confronted with an absolutely immense mastodon skeleton that was mounted in the main room. He would come to learn that it was one of the largest in the world. After Henry had been staring at it for 15 or 20 minutes, a geology professor with a limp had struck up a conversation with him, and had invited Henry to a screening of a film entitled San Francisco, the City That Waits to Die. The professor was showing it for some summer interns from the State University 2 miles away, and offered to let Henry join them. Henry had been fascinated by the film and impressed that he was included with the group. Henry checked the mosquito netting in his tent and switched off the flashlight. He was at the edge of Quabbin Reservoir, about 20 miles north of the school, where he had spent 2 hours shooting after dinner until it got dark. A mile away was the Orange Sport Parachuting Center, opened in 1959 as the first such facility in the country. Henry had taken their first jump course that day at a cost of $65. It was his first airplane flight where the number of takeoffs had been greater than the number of landings. This place is worlds better than what's in Boston, Henry thought as he lay in his tent. He relived the excitement of his first parachute jump, the exhilaration of the exit, followed by the quiet, peaceful experience under the canopy. Henry knew he would make many more parachute jumps in the future. Then he recalled the horrendous traffic that he had endured hitchhiking in Cambridge to get to what he had assumed was a tour for prospective students, only to wind up listening to a pompous nitwit explain at length about the Statue of the Three Lies. I could get to like this place, Henry thought, as he listened to the crickets and slowly drifted off to sleep. October 22nd, 1970. Can you hear me all right? The voice crackled over the radio. Henry Bowman looked around at his 3 passengers. All were nodding their heads. He picked up the microphone and squeezed the talk button. Loud and clear, Professor Foos. This altitude suit you? He asked the man in the 6-passenger Piper a half-mile ahead. It's good for now. It's a little bumpy this low, so if anyone starts feeling queasy, we'll have to go higher. Sounds good, Henry replied. We're all ears. Henry put the microphone back in the clip on the instrument panel and leaned out the mixture on the Cessna Skyhawk until the reading on the exhaust gas temperature gauge peaked. His altimeter read 2,500 feet, which was a little more than 2,200 feet above the ground. He was on a southern course flying directly over the eastern edge of the Connecticut River from Northampton, Massachusetts to Long Island, New York. All right, the first thing you'll notice is what we discussed in the lecture on Thursday. The river's path is almost never straight for very long, and you can see how it has grown more and more crooked serpentine, is the official term because of fluid dynamics. Henry dipped the right wing to give his passengers, particularly the one directly behind him, a better view of the river. Anything which disturbs the course speeds up the water at the outside of the curve. Look at the erosion at the outside of the bend in the river about a half-mile ahead, where the water is traveling fastest. Henry saw that the bank was undercut and trees were about to topple into the river. Ann Ellis in the front passenger seat raised her Nikon for a photo. Up ahead you can see a place where the river curved so much that during the next flood the water broke over the land and made an oxbow, Professor Foos continued on the radio. Can you fly down lower where I can get a better shot of the cut? The young woman asked Henry. Ann Ellis was a geology major in her junior year at Smith College, taking a geo course at Amherst as part of the 5-college exchange program. The hydrodynamics class was on an aerial field trip to observe firsthand some textbook examples of maturing rivers and beachfront erosion. Ann Ellis had been somewhat startled when she had discovered that 3 of the students were going to be flown by a freshman who wouldn't even be eligible to take the course for another year. She had volunteered to be one of the 3 when she had overheard Henry telling Professor Foos that the visibility and photo opportunities would be much better out of the high-wing Cessna than the low-wing Piper that was being flown by a charter pilot. Dropping down to 800 for some quick photos, Chuck, Henry announced over the radio as he reduced power slightly and dropped the nose of the Skyhawk into a fast descent. Isn't this a little steep? Asked Mark Keller, a sophomore taking the course. Only if it makes you feel sick, Henry said in a voice loud enough to be heard over the increased wind noise. We're still a good 20 knots from overspeeding the airframe, Henry said, tapping the airspeed indicator, and it's calm today. If I cut back on power, they'll get farther ahead of us. That Piper's already throttled back so we can keep up, and the Geo Department's paying by the hour. You feel funny or anything? He asked as he glanced over his shoulder. No, Keller answered, as if he had been accused of something shameful. Some people it sneaks up on 'em, Henry said mildly. He leveled the plane about 500 feet off the ground and dipped the wing so Anne could get a clear shot of the undercut riverbank. Perfect, she announced after she had clicked off 2 frames. Henry looked over his shoulder. The 2 men in the back seat were also taking photos. They lowered their cameras and nodded that they had both gotten their pictures. Henry added power and raised the nose slightly to return to his previous altitude. We're dropping down to 2,000, the other pilot announced on the radio. Meeting you there, Henry radioed back. He saw with satisfaction that his separation from the lead plane appeared practically unchanged. It was an hour and a half to Long Island, and by the time the planes flew over the strip of land, Professor, Foose had given the class a full narration of many of the things they had only read about before. The lead plane had alternated between 2,000 and 5,000 feet 4 times, temporarily sacrificing optimum viewing because of upset stomachs. Henry had dutifully followed the Piper's climbs and descents, and his 3 passengers made cracks about what lightweights Foose was stuck with in the other plane. Ann Ellis, Mark Keller, and Garrett Edison were all very comfortable with Henry's flying by the time Long Island appeared. As they passed over the far tip of the island, Foose's voice came over the radio again. We're going to speed up and climb to 5,000 on the way back to save the Geo Department a little rental time. Okay if we take our time getting back? Henry radioed to the other plane. I want to make sure everyone here gets all the good pictures they want. Fine with me, Henry, Foose replied. Any requests? Henry said, looking around at all 3 of his passengers. He put the 172 in a gentle turn out over the Atlantic Ocean. Can we get down close to the beach? Ann Ellis asked. Closer than we were over the river when we got down low? Yeah, Garrett Edison agreed. How low can you go? Can you get in trouble? The law says minimum 500 feet from any person or structure in sparsely populated areas, which this edge is. If I stay a little bit out from the bank, I can get as close to the water as you want. Nobody has a tape measure around here. Long as we don't make anyone think we're about to hit them, we're fine. He thought for a moment. Seems to me you'd want a little altitude for pictures, though. The Skyhawk was a mile out over the ocean, and Henry had it almost all the way turned around towards land again. We'd like to get pictures of the different cuts in the coastline around the jetties, Ann Ellis said quickly. I also think it would be fun to fly close to the land. You got it. Henry pushed the mixture control to full rich and pulled back the power a bit. He adjusted the trim and put the plane in a 135-knot dive. I'm not trying to scare you, he explained. Down low, if you have an engine problem, like it stops running, he added mentally, you can trade airspeed for altitude and give yourself more choices of where to land. I don't ever fly low and slow unless I've got a good place to put down right in front of me. He leveled the plane at what he judged was about 20 feet off the water and 50 yards from shore. Man, you really see your speed down here, Mark Keller said. How fast are we going? About 150 miles per hour, Henry replied. The 3 passengers busied themselves taking photos as the beach raced by. As they neared the end of Long Island, Henry gave the 150 horsepower Lycoming full throttle and eased back on the yoke. Soon they had 2,000 feet of altitude again. As they made their way north over Connecticut, Ann Ellis mentioned that her family lived in a suburb of Hartford. Want to get an aerial photo of your house? Yes. Things look a lot different from the air. A whole new set of reference points. Let's figure out where the house is. They spent several minutes analyzing major roads before homing in on Ann's neighborhood. The young woman used half a roll of film shooting photos of the property. Henry grinned at how excited she became. Have you ever had an engine failure? Mark Keller asked when they back on course to Northampton. I've never had an actual malfunction, Henry explained, but my dad taught me to fly, and he was a big believer in emergency preparation. He'd switch the ignition off and pull the key when we were out flying, and tell me to make a real engine-out emergency landing. First few times he had to take it away from me and put it down himself to show me it could always be. Done. He wouldn't restart the engine until we were on the ground. I got to where I was pretty good at always knowing where the wind's coming from and always noticing spots I could put down. So I must have made 30 or 40 engine-out landings on bean fields and country roads. Put down on a golf course once, too. Isn't that illegal? Ann Ellis asked. Not very, Henry said with a shrug. We never heard anything, and the few times anyone was around, they thought a biplane was so neat they didn't care where we'd landed. You learned to fly in a biplane? A steerman my dad used to teach aerobatics to Navy pilots in during World War II. Do you do aerobatics? Ann Ellis looked at the other two passengers. Can you show us something? Mark and Garrett were about to protest, but Henry shook his head and spoke before they could. Not in this aircraft. It's not approved for it. I could do a barrel roll. It wouldn't overstress anything. But an inverted maneuver is the kind of thing people can see and catch on camera, and you can lose your license. Not like flying a little too close to an empty beach shack where no one can measure your exact distance, or putting down in a field where you can claim you lost power. Flying's not like driving, where every state sets its own rules and they're all pretty reasonable. The FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration, they run everything, and those federal guys can be a bunch of bastards. There's a lot more federal and administration in the Federal Aviation Administration than there is aviation. That's why there's almost no new designs coming out of the factories. Too expensive to jump through all the government hoops. We're sitting in a 2-year-old airplane that's no more advanced than some of the stuff you could buy in the 30s. That engine, he said, pointing towards the nose of the plane, is essentially an oversized version of the 1939 predecessor to the Volkswagen. This old Lycoming is Stone Age compared to a Chevrolet V8 you can buy new in the crate from GM for $700. Henry stopped lecturing and thought for a few moments. There is one precision maneuver I can show you that doesn't look like anything from the outside, just a climb and a dive. From inside the plane, it's pretty interesting. It's how they train the astronauts. He nodded and came to a decision. Hold your camera about even with your chin, he said to Ann Ellis. Like this? She asked. Point the lens straight forward, a little higher so Matt and Garrett can see it. Yeah, that's it. When I say now, let go of it and start counting to 10 in a loud voice at about a 1-second pace, okay? Ann Ellis looked dubious, but nodded. Her Nikon was on a wide strap around her neck. Watch your camera, guys, Henry said to the pair in the back seat. Henry gave the Cessna full throttle and lowered the nose until the airspeed needle was almost at the far end of the yellow arc, and scanned the air ahead and above him for any sign of traffic. He leveled the aircraft with the needle touching the end of the yellow, and then pulled it up into a fairly steep climb. Ann Ellis felt her body press into the seat with 3 times its normal weight. Ready? Now, Henry commanded as he eased the yoke forward. Ann Ellis let go of her camera just as the pressure vanished, and she felt herself levitate an inch off the seat cushion. The Nikon floated in front of her face, hovering magically in the air. She was so astonished at this spectacle that she completely forgot to count to 10. Henry Bowman kept track of the airspeed needle with his peripheral vision as he looked at the floating camera and continued to apply precise pressure on the yoke of the aircraft while easing back on the throttle. When the needle was a half-inch from the end of the yellow arc, he yelled, "Grab it!" Yanked the power back to idle and eased back on the yoke to bring the Skyhawk out of the dive. Man, what was that? Garrett Edison yelled when the wind noise had subsided. Henry took a deep breath. When we were in the climb, and Ann let go of her camera, from the reference point of the ground, the camera behaved as if it were a projectile launched at an upward angle in a vacuum. The upward angle was the angle of our climb at the instant I pushed the yoke forward, and the camera acted as if it was in a vacuum because the plane is a closed compartment and the camera doesn't feel wind resistance any more than our faces do. With me so far? Yeah. The camera keeps moving forward at a constant speed relative to the ground, and that constant speed is the same as the forward component of the plane's speed at the instant Ann let go of the camera. Got that? Yeah. Okay, now because of gravity, as soon as Ann lets go of it, the camera instantly starts accelerating towards the ground, at a rate equal to that of the force of gravity, about 32 feet per second. Right? Yeah, right. Edison was starting to see where this was going. What I just did was fly the plane on the exact ballistic path of the camera. The trick is to arc the plane over at just the right rate so that the camera doesn't move inside the plane. Too big an arc and it would have fallen in her lap. Too tight and the camera would have bounced off the headliner. When you make an object float like that, you achieve perfect zero-G conditions. For about 8 seconds there, we were all absolutely weightless, as I guess you noticed. No shit, Ann Ellis said meaningfully. Henry was momentarily embarrassed. That's how they train the astronauts for weightlessness, he explained. They use a stripped Boeing 707 with padding all over the inside, and since it's a lot faster, they get a lot bigger arc. I think they can get around 30 seconds of zero. G conditions in a 707. They also do it over and over again, and the astronauts have nicknamed that particular plane the Vomit Comet. He shrugged. It's one of the more difficult precision maneuvers, and it's not too hard on the equipment. Doesn't look like much from the ground, though. He smiled. My dad could do that same trick while he made the plane do a barrel roll. That really looked weird. The camera or whatever would look like it was rotating all by itself while it floated in front of your face. He shook his head. I'm not nearly that good. Ann Ellis said nothing. Obviously underwhelmed, Henry thought to himself. That's okay. She had fun when we blasted down the beach. In reality, Ann Ellis was silent for a very different reason. The few moments of 3G pressure followed immediately by 8 seconds of weightlessness had had a very interesting effect on her insides. She felt as if she were on the verge of orgasm. Do you always have that kind of control? She said under her breath. Henry glanced over, thinking the girl had said something. Guess I imagined it, he decided. Henry Bowman spent the next hour putting the plane in perfect picture-taking position over various points of geological interest. His passengers related to him some of the things Professor Foos had explained in class but not in the air. Henry Bowman entered the traffic pattern at 1,500 feet over Loeffler Airport in Northampton, Massachusetts. He glanced at his gauges, pulled his mixture control to full lean, and pulled the key out of the ignition. His 3 passengers watched in horror as the propeller in front of them stopped spinning and came to a halt. There was still wind noise, but the geology students had grown used to the sound of the engine. To them, the airplane now seemed as quiet as death. I'm going to land, turn off the runway, and taxi into the spot next to that black and yellow clipped-wing Cub with the big tires down there, Henry announced. It was an old stunt that Dwayne Cole had made his trademark at the end of almost every one of his airshow routines. Henry turned onto base leg earlier than usual as he was descending faster than normal, flared cleanly, and greased the Skyhawk onto the asphalt a third of the way down the runway. As his forward momentum declined, he turned off onto the taxiway at midfield, steered over towards the tie-down spot, and braked to a halt on the centerline. Matt and Garrett were impressed and thanked Henry sincerely. Glad to do it, particularly since the department pays to rent the plane. He squinted and grinned. And I think today has convinced me to major in geology as well as economics. Best school for it, Matt asserted. Garrett concurred. Ann Ellis had also made a decision, one that concerned Henry Bowman's plans for that evening. It was going to make her roommate very upset, but she decided she didn't care. Hi, I'm Dick Gaines. Mind if I sit here? Free country, man, one of the 6 students at the lunch table said. Great. Listen, I won't take up your time, but I'm running for class president, and I'd like your vote, Gaines said as soon as he had put down his tray. President? A young man with short black hair and acne said, You're not even in our fraternity, are you? I know I've never seen you before. Class president, Artie, not frat president, one of the others corrected as he turned towards Dick Gaines. He got in here on an athletic scholarship, the young man explained. Hey, fuck you, asshole, I heard him wrong is all. Artie's just pissed off he didn't get laid at Stevens last week. He's been jacking off in the shower so much, every time it rains he gets a hard-on. The whole table laughed. Richard joined in nervously. The freshman class hasn't had much of a voice in student government, and I'd like to change that, Richard said, when the laughter had died down. Taylor here's got a voice. Should have heard him in algebra class yesterday. 7 can answer that. Probably the only time he's ever paid attention. Thought the teacher was going to drop his chalk. Well, I guess that must have been funny. I never could figure out algebra, Richard admitted. You guys ready for some hoops? One of the boys asked. Sounds good, another answered, and all 6 of them got up to bust their trays and leave the dining room. Hey, remember Dick Gaines for class president, Richard said to their departing backs. Damn, I blew that one, he thought angrily. They probably won't even bother to vote. Richard Gaines was only partially right. It was true that student elections were not taken very seriously, particularly at state universities in Missouri. It was also true that several people at the table would not remember his name an hour later. In the election that would be held just before Thanksgiving break, 5 of the 6 classmates he had met that evening would indeed have other more important things to do and would not bother to vote. The 6th would happen to be near the school post office where the balloting was being done, and would cast his vote for the one name he vaguely recognized. With about 18% of the class voting, Richard's efforts at meeting every one of his classmates at the university would pay off. He would win the election with a solid 4% of his class supporting him. His victory would not have been possible if those people had not known his name. Hey, Hines! Remember our conversation on the Econ 11 assignment of analyzing a local business? The tenured professor asked. The Amherst College Economics Department chairman looked up from his book at the man who had just entered the faculty lounge and called his name. Remember you were saying all the papers on Massachusetts pizza delivery services were putting you to sleep? Yes, what about it? Take a look at this one. The chairman took the proffered paper from his associate, readjusted his glasses, and read the title page aloud. The Economics of the Smith & Wesson. 44 Magnum revolver and the pricing strategy of its manufacturer. He looked over the tops of his glasses. Another butter advocate? He asked. Just read it, Nicholson said with a smile. Take you 2 minutes. Department Chairman Kohler was known by his colleagues in the department for his ability to digest the printed word. He folded back the title page and scanned the paper. The only double action revolver chambered for this cartridge, Kohler quoted. Says the Springfield plant's too small for current military demand, and all Smith & Wesson commercial guns are now back-ordered, but long before the Vietnam War was a factor, this model was hard to find, and in fact has always been a rarity that commands a price in excess of retail. He scanned a bit further, then read, although the factory has always honored their listed dealer price on all guns, dealers regularly charge and get a substantial premium for this model, particularly in the longer barrel lengths. Kohler lowered the paper and laughed. Well, that just means the CFO flunked Econ 11 and the factory is incorrectly pricing their product. Keep reading. The factory's setting of the Model 29's price below the intersection point of the supply and demand curves would initially lead one to assume that the company's chief financial officer was not doing his job. Kohler quoted, and should therefore be fired, he editorialized with a laugh. But there is an alternative explanation that bears consideration. Kohler looked up at his associate. I can't wait to hear this one, he said, and continued to read. It is possible that the decision makers at the firm believe that rarity adds to this model's appeal and by extension the desirability of the entire Smith & Wesson line. From my own experience, however, I believe there is an alternative explanation. The models 29, 27, and 57 are made in a limited production assembly facility involving large amounts of hand fitting. These arms exhibit a quality of fit and finish even greater than that of the rest of the company's product line. By actual tests, these premier models also shoot more accurately than Smith & Wesson's other offerings. I believe it is impossible to significantly increase production rates of the 44 Magnum using existing production methods and facilities. Prices from the factory, currently $165 on this low-volume model, are kept below free market equilibrium levels, likely because of fears of the substantial loss of goodwill should it be perceived by customers that Smith & Wesson has suddenly started gouging them. Accordingly, and in light of the fact that Smith & Wesson is no longer family-owned but is a part of the South American conglomerate Bangor Punta, dare I detect a hint of U.S. pride here? Kohler interjected. I see 4 possible changes in the production and pricing of this arm. Kohler lowered his voice and read the 4 suggestions. 1. A slight reduction in standards of overall quality. 2. Construction of new plant and facilities for increased production of all models. 3. Design changes to the weapons themselves, specifically the elimination of minor features to lower unit production costs. 4. Substantial price increases at the factory level. Ha! Listen to this. Bangor Punta has already implemented number 1 and has started on number 2. I believe 3 will follow. The fourth change, a sudden jump in factory prices, is, in my opinion, unlikely to occur. The first 3 courses of action are less obvious to the public, and the present demands of war production will not last forever. Kohler read on silently, then looked up. So the sleazy South Americans have lowered the quality of recent magnums, but according to your author, there are enough older guns around to satisfy the people who shoot. And here he had to refer to the text. Over 10,000 rounds per year, or who regularly engage targets over 150 yards away. He continued to scan the paper. Now here's some good advice for us if we decide that's what we want to do next semester. Your Mr. Bowman says we should look for one with a serial number below 8,300,000. Well, that's certainly good to know, wouldn't you say? Not exactly local pepperoni costs have risen lately. Lowering profit margins, is it? Give this guy an, Kohler said as he handed back the paper. I already did. The first thing I have to tell you, Ann Ellis explained, is that my roommate is going to be upset if she finds us here together. What about the house mother? Henry asked. She's kind of like the FAA, Ann replied with a laugh. We don't want to do anything obvious that she can actually see, like running naked down the hallway. We'll keep the door locked. Okay, Henry said. At that moment, he didn't trust his voice with anything over 2 syllables. Seriously, if Rachel arrives, she may go a little crazy. Anne looked pointedly at her guest. Henry shrugged. Okay, he repeated agreeably. Do you understand what I'm saying? Ann Ellis demanded. Suddenly, Henry understood exactly what Ann Ellis was saying, and he started laughing. I'm glad to be a substitute, but I really don't want to get shot, he said after a moment. Although it might be worth it, he added mentally. Ann Ellis flushed scarlet. Don't think of it like that, she said quickly. And getting shot? No, she just throws tantrums. Is that why there isn't anything breakable in here? Henry asked with a grin. Ann Ellis was startled. She looked around the small dorm room in Northrop House and realized there wasn't anything fragile in it. Don't miss a thing, do you? She muttered, then turned towards Henry with a wicked smile. Let's see if you think this piece of equipment's obsolete, Anne said as she moved closer to her guest. Henry Bowman would later reflect that shooting, skiing, and flying had been the 3 things he had experienced in his life that had actually turned out to be much better than he had expected. That evening, he discovered a 4th. March 14th, 1971. Hey, Boone, phone's for you. Says it's the hospital. The bartender held out the telephone receiver. A heavy, sour-looking man looked up from the pool table. He wore blue cotton twill work pants and a stained T-shirt that was stretched taut over his substantial belly. An unfiltered cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth. He made no move towards the bar. Lady says your wife is in labor. Says you need to get down there. Tell her I'll be there in a bit. Labor always takes her a good long while. Boone Caswell gave the bartender a look that conveyed the fact that there would be no further discussion of the matter. The bartender spoke quickly into the phone and then hung up. Caswell went back to his pool game. Congratulations, Boone, you're a father again. The doctor smiled at the big man with an enthusiasm he did not feel. He did not like Boone Caswell. He did not know anyone in the town of Rolla, Missouri who did, for that matter. Too many people had noticed the regular appearance of bruises on Myra Boone's timid wife. There were some which had not quite faded even when she came to the delivery room. Boy or girl? The man demanded. You have a beautiful, healthy 7-pound, 2-ounce daughter, Boone, and Myra is doing well. Both your other daughters are in with Myra and the baby. Want to see them? He started to usher the man into the other room, but Caswell turned on his heel. Maybe when they get home, he said with his back to the doctor as he headed out the door. June 7th, 1971. Anybody here want to go on a couple of raids? Got 2 in the same building. Could use some extra muscle. Lucia Mio looked up at the man who asked the question. Federal. Narcotics, maybe. Assholes sometimes, but hell, a raid is a raid. He glanced around the room. Just sitting on my ass here, he thought to himself. Wish I had my 357, though. Yeah, I'll go along. I've got my PPK with me, but that's all. The Fed waved his hand in a dismissive gesture at Lou's statement. Don't worry about that. The federal agent stared at Chiamio, who looked like someone you would call if you had a very heavy object that you needed lifted or moved, then nodded. We can use you on the ram. He looked around the room. Anyone else? Several of the other off-duty officers hanging around the Montgomery County Police Department also volunteered to join in on the raid. What time we going in? One of them asked. We'll be leaving in a few minutes. Probably hit the first one 9:30 or so, the Fed replied. Chimio nodded. He was about to ask for more details about the raid when he heard another Montgomery County officer call his name. Hey, Lou, I've been meaning to ask you about this 45 of mine. Take a look at it. I can't hit shit with it. Chimio laughed. Because he liked shooting and practiced a lot, he was a good shot and very knowledgeable about handguns. Other officers often came to him with gun questions or gunsmithing problems. Have you considered that the problem may not be the gun, Jimmy? Ah, fuck you too. No, really, look at this. Is this too much slop in the barrel bushing, or are they all like that? The policeman pulled the slide partway back to show Lou that the gun was empty, then let it snap forward. He demonstrated how he could wiggle the end of the barrel with the tip of his finger. Chimio glanced over his shoulder at the Fed, who was now talking to someone else. Doubt they need this much backup, he thought when he saw the number of officers, then mentally shrugged. Might get in on some excitement. Sure has been a boring-ass week around here. He turned back to the problem of the inaccurate. 45. Lou Chimio never did get around to asking what the raid was about. The four men nearest the door could hear the sound of a television set inside the apartment. Most of the other 22 police agents were too far away to hear it, so Agent William Seals, who was leading the raid, made hand motions to them. He let the men know that the apartment was occupied and that they should remain silent. Okay, on 3, Seals whispered. 1, 2, 3. Chimio and the other 3 men put all their strength behind the battering ram, and the apartment door frame splintered and gave way. Lou Chimio was the second officer in the room. His adrenaline level was up, as it always was on a raid, and his senses felt unusually keen. His hand grabbed the butt of his Walther as other officers and agents poured into the room. Lou was drawing the weapon in a practiced motion when his brain registered that the only occupants of the room other than the raiding party were a young girl of 10 or 12 who was sitting on a couch and the much younger child she was holding on her lap. The girl looked terrified, and the small child, frightened by the noise and sensing the older girl's fear, started to cry. Chimio kept his Walther pointed at the floor as he scanned the room. It soon became apparent that the girl, who they would later learn was 10 years old, was babysitting that evening, and no one else was in the apartment. After a quick examination to confirm that the apartment was indeed empty, the lead agent scribbled a note on a piece of paper and thrust it at the child. Give this to your parents when they get home, he commanded. Hope we have better luck at the next one, Seals muttered as he led his comrades out of the apartment. The girl held the paper without looking at it and stared at the strange, disheveled men leaving through the shattered doorway. She had no idea who they were or what they had come for. This was understandable, as not a single one of the men who had crowded into the efficiency apartment was wearing a police uniform or had ever mentioned that he was a police officer. Lou Chimio was starting to get a very bad feeling about the whole evening. 27-year-old Kenyon Baloo was taking a bath. He would have preferred a shower, as it was a chore for a grown man to wash and rinse himself in a cramped tub. The shower head still wasn't fixed, though, so a bath it was. It wasn't the difficulty Ken minded that night, however, but rather the fact that it took more time. This was relevant because as soon as Ken Baloo finished his bath, he was going to get laid. His wife Sarah Louise had made that abundantly clear 10 minutes earlier. Her exact words had been, "If you aren't out of the bathtub, dried off, and in bed with me in 15 minutes, big boy, I'm going to have to start without you." Remember the Boy Scouts' motto, "Be prepared." Sarah Louise was joking about the fact that her husband, a pressman for the Washington Post newspaper, was also a scout troop leader. Newspaper articles would later mention this fact as a point of interest. Baloo finished rinsing himself, flipped the tub drain to open, and was about to stand up when he heard muffled noises outside the apartment. Federal officers with a search warrant, Agent Seals announced in a normal speaking voice, making no move to knock on the door. Lou Chiamillo shot him a look, and the Fed glared at the local cop as if to say, "You gonna make something of it, asshole?" The man did not like being second-guessed about law enforcement procedures by a line officer in a county department. "Ken, I think there's somebody at our door," a nude Sarah Louise Baloo shouted to her husband. "And I don't have any clothes on," she added unnecessarily. She glanced at her wrist, realized her watch was lying on the dresser across the room, and scowled. Neither she nor her husband were expecting anyone, and the hour was late. "Open the door, federal agents," the agent leading the raid said, his voice a little louder this time. "I'll get it," the husband shouted back to his wife. Ken Baloo thought he had heard someone say something that sounded like, "Open the door," but the rest hadn't been clear. He stepped out of the tub and wrapped a towel around his waist. He intended to send whoever it was on his way post-haste. "You catch that?" one of the officers asked. The others, including Lou Chiamillo, shook their heads. "There's two of them, I heard that much," the lead agent stated. "The second one was a man's voice. That's good enough for me." Lou Chiamillo had been about to say that if he and the agents couldn't understand what the people in the apartment were saying, it was logical to assume that the occupants had not understood the Treasury agent's command either, but Seals was already barking more orders. "Let's bust this door open before they have a chance to get out the back or get rid of the evidence. We got over 20 guys here," Lou thought. "Why aren't any of them around back already?" He shrugged inwardly. "Mine not to reason why," Chiamillo thought as he prepared to use the ram. "Must be a narco raid." He couldn't think of any contraband other than narcotics that could be disposed of on a moment's notice inside an apartment. He let the men know that the apartment was occupied and that they should remain silent. "Okay, on three," Seals whispered. 1, 2, 3. The battering ram crashed into the wood, but unlike the door in the previous raid, this one held. Ken Baloo had installed a door that was reinforced with steel. The door frame cracked, but did not give way. "Again!" Agent Seals commanded. Ken and Sarah Louise, who were in separate rooms of the apartment, both heard the tremendous crash at their door and realized that they were under attack. Ken Baloo ran out of the bathroom, pulled open his desk drawer, and grabbed a percussion revolver made in 1847. Sarah Louise had put on her bikini panties and was about to reach for her bra when the first impact hit the entrance to the apartment. She immediately leaped out of bed and started toward the bedroom door. Dressed or not, she was going to help her husband fight off whoever or whatever was invading their home. Some people, particularly those with little interest in firearms, would later puzzle over the oddity that a man who felt he needed a weapon for home defense would choose a 120-year-old cap-and-ball black powder revolver for the purpose. They would correctly point out that even a 100-year-old revolver would have been a far better choice, as 1870 was the period when cartridge weapons came into common use and replaced guns that used loose powder, round balls, and percussion caps. Ken Baloo had a loaded cap-and-ball antique instead of a 20th century Colt or Smith & Wesson. For a very simple reason, he did not at that moment own a more modern handgun. Ken Baloo, the Washington Post pressman and part-time Boy Scout troop leader, did own a modern shotgun for bird hunting. He was primarily a collector of antique arms, however, and he had a fine collection of 1840s to era cap-and-ball revolvers in addition to the one in his hand. The Baloos lived in a middle-class integrated apartment building. There had been a burglary or two in the area, but violent crime was not a major concern for most residents of Silver Spring, Maryland. In fact, Ken Baloo had not kept any loaded firearm available for protection when he had been single, for he had viewed risks from criminals as minimal. It was only under the contract of marriage that he had recognized his obligation to guarantee another person's safety. He had thought of buying a Smith & Wesson, but monthly bills and other financial concerns had delayed that event. That was the reason that when the 27-year-old scout leader ran naked and dripping wet towards his living room, prepared to protect his wife from whoever was breaking into their apartment, He was carrying a gun that had been made approximately 50 years before the first airplane, 30 years before the first telephone, 18 years before the abolition of slavery, and 2 years before the birth of his own great-great-great-grandfather. As soon as the door crashed open and the plainclothes raiding party poured into the Ballou's living room, Lucia Mio had his Walther PPK in his hand. His arms were extended and his pistol was pointed at the entrance to the narrow hallway that led to the rest of the apartment. Ken Ballou came running down the hallway and Chiamio put the front sight of the PPK on his head, but he held his fire until he saw that the man was armed. This was the reason that when Lou Chiamio squeezed the trigger of his PPK, several shots had already been fired by other participants in the raid. Ballou collapsed as shots continued to ring out in the apartment. The nude man's last act was to pull the trigger of his antique revolver, discharging the weapon at a distance of 10 inches into a bookcase nearby. Then his brain function shut down and he collapsed behind a partition in the hallway. Chiamio watched Ballou fall behind the partition, which was made of concrete blocks. It was a perfect let-off, he thought. I know I hit him. The deputy sheriff's adrenaline was pumping, but he held his fire as the federal agents continued to pour bullets at the man's body. The painful noise of the shots was still ringing in his ears when Lou realized that some of the sound was coming from a nearly nude woman who had run to the side of her fallen husband. She was screaming, and Chiamio started to step towards her, but a federal agent rushed past him and pulled her away from her husband's body. The agent immediately began to recite Sarah Louise's rights to her, but she was hysterical, and obviously did not hear or understand a word of what was said. Ballou's wife cringed in fear, and Chiamio suddenly realized something that troubled him greatly. She doesn't know we're cops, not a single one of us is in uniform. The agent who had read Sarah Louise's rights pulled handcuffs out of his pocket, then shoved the woman out the door. Chiamio turned away and stared at the inert form on the floor. One of the feds was giving the body a casual glance as he hurried into the other room. Lou Chiamio took measured, even breaths. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, and willed the organ to slow down. He looked around the modest apartment trying to take it in, as scruffy-looking federal officers and other plainclothes police agents swarmed through the small area. The feds were busy tearing the place apart, searching for evidence. Ballou's wife, wearing only panties and handcuffs, was still screaming hysterically and trying to get back in the apartment to be with the body of her husband. Pay dirt. Chiamio heard an agent yell from what he would later learn was Ken Ballou's study. Look what we got here. He walked proudly towards his supervisor. The man was carrying several dummy hand grenades of the type that were sold at army surplus and hardware stores, usually alongside the canteens, flashlights, and ammo cans. Lou knew what real grenades looked like. He and his father had set off dozens of live ones out in the country when he was a boy. He could instantly tell that these grenades were inert. They had no detonators, their bases were drilled, and it was easy to see that they were empty. One of them was glued to a piece of wood and had a numbered tag hanging from its handle. Chiamio watched as the agent ripped the wood from the grenade and tossed it aside. He stepped over and looked at the piece that the agent had discarded. The words, Complaint Department, please take a number, were embossed on a plaque attached to the piece of stained pine. Chiamio smiled, then quickly sobered as he watched the federal agents racing around the place, pulling out drawers and turning things over. One was coming down the hallway carrying a side-by-side 20-gauge. Write this up too, the man said, grinning and holding the $80 bird gun, as if it were $1 million worth of stolen jewels. I found these, another man announced. He was holding aloft a thin cardboard box about the size of a book of paper matches, yellow with blue and red printing on it. Chiamio recognized it instantly as a box of Winchester primers for reloading shotgun shells, available for less than $1 at any gun or hardware store. The bad feeling Lou Chiamio had felt earlier came back with multiplied intensity. Who are these assholes? Lou wondered, not for the first time that night. Why the fuck do they care about reloading supplies and flea market junk? Who's the guy we just killed? And what did they want him for? Lou Chiamio was about to find out the answers to at least some of these questions. Tax agents? Lou Chiamio demanded in an outraged whisper. The other Montgomery County police officer put his hand on his friend's arm and tried to reassure him. We thought you knew, Lou. Chiamio slapped the hand away. Thought I knew? There were more than 20 of us. We killed that guy. Jamil was apoplectic. 24 armed men dressed like a bunch of biker trash and carrying a battering ram raid a guy's apartment and kill him, and now you trying to tell me the feds letting the raid were just a bunch of pencil-pushing assholes from the ATF? Those guys are supposed to be checking paperwork, for Christ's sake. His mouth hung slack as he waited for a reply. When none came, he went on, his voice rising in the process. What did they have on him, huh? Tell me that. What the fuck did they have on him? They did say they found a 4-inch piece cut off a shotgun barrel, the policeman answered lamely. And I'll bet it came off that little side-by-side 20 gauge I saw one of them assholes carrying. Barrels were at least 20 inches long, looked more like 22. I'd bet my badge that gun's legal. Chiamillo stabbed his finger angrily at the other officer before continuing. And even if the poor bastard had cut the thing down below 18, so what? So he's made an NFA weapon, and under the National Firearms Act of 1934, he owes the IRS $200 tax on it. You ever owe the IRS $200, Hal? Take it easy, Lou. Fuck taking it easy. You weren't one of the first guys in the door like I was, and you didn't pop a cap at that poor bastard because of them tax assholes. Answer my question. You ever owe the IRS $200? I sure as shit have. Think maybe the taxmen should bust your door down when you and your wife are standing around naked and put a few slugs in you because they think maybe you owe them $200? Of course I've owed the IRS $200, his friend said soothingly. But those were ATF agents, Lou. They're a part of the IRS, but you and I both know they don't do income tax work. They're alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Right, Lou exploded. And they're an alcohol, tobacco, and firearms tax agency. They go around and make sure all the fucking tax seals are pasted on the goddamn whiskey bottles and cigarette packs. You think. It'd be fine if Agent fucking Neil rounded up some local cops to go bust in on the guy who owns the Camel Cigarette Company, bust his door down with a battering ram and kill him coming out of the shower on information from a reliable informant that he had cigarettes under his bed and he owed $200 tax on them? His friend made no reply but lowered his eyes. Gotta be guns. Okay, how about the reliable informant tells him Sturm, Ruger hasn't paid the government its 11% excise tax on a batch of 357 seconds. Think the ATF guys should go break into Bill Ruger's house in the middle of the night? He's probably pulled a gun or two out the back door of the plant for his own use, and they'd be ones made after the Civil War. Maybe 26 guys wouldn't be enough. Hell, maybe they should fuck breaking down the door and just bum him out. Chiamillo shook his head in disgust, then exploded in frustration. Jesus, I can't believe they even let those stupid tax cocksuckers carry guns at all. He suddenly thought of something and his eyes narrowed. Who's got the warrant? I want to see what's listed on the fucking search warrant. Lou Chiamillo is not yet aware of several things. First of all, Chiamillo did not know that the search warrant for Baloo's apartment was, for the most part, still blank. The time would be filled in as 8:31 p.m., the last legal minute of daylight on June 7th, as the blank warrant had specified that the search had to be conducted during daylight hours. Items to be searched for would also soon be filled in, but not as short-barreled shotguns, for a measuring tape would reveal that the barrels on Baloo's gun were well over the 18 minimum. Instead, hand grenades would be written in the proper place on the warrant, in keeping with the nature of what was seized. Weeks later, the agency would be forced to admit that dummy grenades were not a registerable item on which tax was due. This admission would occur when a number of citizens around the country would produce proof that after passage of the 1968 Gun Control Act, they had applied to the ATF to register inert grenades identical to Baloo's, and that their applications had been returned to them rejected, with the written statement that such items were not subject to registration and taxation by the federal government. Undaunted, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the Internal Revenue Service would then, 3 weeks after the raid, retrieve the box of shot shell primers and some paper caps for a toy cap pistol from the police department storage locker. They would produce these items as evidence that Baloo intended to make live grenades without paying the tax on them, thus justifying their raid. The ATF agency would be forced to admit that a dummy grenade successfully jerry-rigged with a shot shell primer and some black powder would explode the instant the handle was released, Not 5 seconds later, but the feds would insist that this minor fact was not relevant to their case in any way. Second of all, Chimio did not know that Kenyon F. Ballou had not been killed in the raid. Ballou was at that moment in a coma and hooked up to life support systems at a local hospital, and would remain attached to them until his condition stabilized. Third, Chimio did not know that only one of the 9 bullets the raiders had fired had hit Ballou. When that single bullet had struck Ballou between the eyes, it had penetrated his brain and lodged in his cerebral cortex, instantly causing permanent paralysis and brain damage. Ballou had fallen behind the reinforced partition, and the concrete blocks had stopped the 4 additional shots the federal agents had fired at his unconscious body. Ken Ballou was not dead, merely paralyzed and brain damaged, after being shot between the eyes at 10 feet, and this was because the one bullet that had hit him was from a 380 automatic. The 380 Auto is a weak cartridge that was designed in 1908 for use in small pocket pistols for women. No police department in the entire United States issues 380 automatics as duty sidearms for its uniformed officers, but many officers carry a 380 of one make or another when off duty because of the gun's small size. The last thing that Lou Chimillo did not yet know but would eventually learn was that of the 26 IRS agents and local police officers participating in the disastrous raid on Ken Ballou's apartment, only one of them had been carrying a pistol chambered for the 380 automatic cartridge. Had Ballou been shot in the brain with a more powerful 38 or 357, he would almost certainly have been killed. Furthermore, no one would have ever been able to determine which man had fired the fatal shot, since all of the other shots fired that night had been one or the other of these 2 calibers. As it was, there was only one gun from which the slug now in Ken Ballou's brain could have been fired. This fact would be learned when Ballou's condition was such that the doctors could finally extract the copper and lead projectile and give it to the police for examination. The bullet that left the Washington Post pressman, scout leader, and antique arms collector permanently paralyzed and brain damaged had been fired from a Walther PPK, and that PPK was currently resting inside the waistband of Lou Chimillo's pants. August 6, 1971. Listen to this shit. Secretary of the Treasury John B. Connolly said he had reviewed the investigative report and concluded that the actions of the law enforcement personnel in executing the search warrant for the Ballou apartment were legally proper under the circumstances. Bernie Sutter put the newspaper down and snorted in derision. The fix is in. Henry Bowman glanced over at the man, but said nothing. Bernie was the proprietor of Sutter's Sports Shop, a small, cluttered gun store in middle-class Overland, which was in North St. Louis County. Well, of course, said Thomas J. Fleming as he looked up from the 1887 Belgian service revolver he was examining. 26 armed men dressed in old clothes. Ties the logical team to assemble when you know you're up against a shrewd adversary. He went on rapidly. Look, Ballou had a reinforced door, right? Ties an indication he was committing crimes behind it. He sent his wife into a separate part of the house that was probably so they could sucker the feds in a pincer maneuver. They had all their claws off. Obviously, this was to distract the officers. And the police know their own limitations. They know that their shooting skills are well below those of private citizens. They had to have 26 on their side to give themselves a chance that someone would hit the man they were trying to kill. And as you can see, their strategy worked to perfection. They fired 9 shots at 10 feet. And just as they had hoped, one of them hit Ballou. The raid went perfectly. Not a single police agent was injured. Thomas J. Fleming was 2 years out of the University of Chicago School of Law. Slender, dark-haired, clean-shaven, of medium height, and wearing glasses, Tom Fleming was the proverbial man who could disappear in a crowd of one. That was true, however, only so long as Tom Fleming did not open his mouth. As soon as he started speaking, anyone listening could not avoid recognizing the tremendous store of energy the man possessed. Nor were they likely to miss his biting wit. It would also be obvious that Fleming understood the Constitution better than most lawyers, and that he absolutely despised governmental infringements on his civil rights. There's only one real reason to become a lawyer, he had been known to say to close friends in private. That's so nobody can fuck with you. He returned his attention to the 19th century Belgian revolver. I wonder what the Treasury Department would consider acting improperly. Another regular, Stokely Meyer, threw out. Using a nuke, maybe, Bernie said glumly. Sutler Sport Shop in North County was very different from Goodman's for guns in downtown St. Louis. Whereas the Goodman brothers' clientele tended to be well-heeled owners of finely made arms, Bernie Suter catered to middle-class patrons who were looking for military surplus rifles or second-hand Calls and Remingtons, and who spent a large fraction of their shooting dollars on ammunition. Stokely Meyer, Henry Bowman, and Max Collins were three of a small number of St. Louisans who regularly visited both stores. Since Henry had turned 16 2.5 years before, he had become a regular visitor to the store, which was 12 miles from his house. A lot of high-volume shooters congregated there. Tom Fleming was one of these, and he had been patronizing Sutter's since the age of 8. His father, Thomas Albert Ta Fleming, had died when the boy was 11. From then until he acquired his first car shortly before his 17th birthday, Tom Fleming had made the 8-mile trip to the gun shop on his bicycle. Fleming especially liked the fact that Bernie Sutter would put guns in layaway. Up until the law change in 1968, Sutter did this even for customers that weren't yet old enough to drive. He'd keep the customer's money clipped to a file card with the gun's description written on it in the store's safe until the full amount was attached. Most of Fleming's steadily growing collection had been acquired from Bernie in this fashion, whereas Henry's favorite sporting arms were, in no particular order, long-range rifles, elephant guns, and 44 Magnum revolvers. Fleming gravitated towards military rifles and handguns, especially the .45 automatic Colt. Both young men liked machine guns, although unlike Henry Bowman, Tom Fleming did not own any full auto weapons on which the NFA branch of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had bestowed its governmental blessing. Furthermore, Fleming owned no cannons at all when he had been in junior high school, long before the 1968 Gun Control Act reclassified military arms over .50 caliber as destructive devices. Fleming had studied the ads offering lattes for under $100. At that time, he had never figured out how to get the 8.1, 2-foot, 110-pound weapon home from the freight depot on his bicycle. By the time he got a car, college was looming, and owning a latte was long forgotten. This guy Ballou must have been doing some other stuff that isn't in the paper. Threw out a local skeet shooter who bought his shotgun shells at Bernie's. I can't believe our own government would do something like this, even by accident. Come on, 26 agents? They'd never put that many cops on some guy's apartment if he really was just a collector of old cap and ball guns. We're not getting the whole story. Are you nuts? Tom Fleming exclaimed. The Belgian revolver was forgotten as he turned to face the man. Haven't you read any history, like maybe what happened in Germany in the 30s? Fleming was currently involved with a woman he had first met in college. She was slender, vivacious, and possessed of a remarkable sex drive. She was Jewish, and one entire branch of her family had been executed in Buchenwald. This is the United States, the skeet shooter said with slight irritation. Which of course makes us immune to any violations of our civil rights, Tom Fleming immediately replied with a voice that dripped sarcasm. Listen, he continued, his tone changing to one of exposition. For the last 100 years, cops have known it was okay to beat on people and sometimes kill them, as long as they only beat on and killed colored guys. Then, starting a few years ago, cops learned they could beat on and kill not only colored guys, but also white guys, as long as the white guys had long hair, ratty clothes, no jobs, and were out in public bitching about Vietnam. Now, in addition to colored guys, and white guys that have long hair, ratty clothes, and no jobs who are out protesting in public, the cops have learned it's okay to beat and kill white guys with short hair, nice clothes, and good jobs inside their own homes, if the white guy owns guns. Fleming took a breath and raised his index finger. He realized he was lecturing again, but it was a habit he had a very hard time resisting. The others in the shop were giving him their full attention. When they came for the trade unionists, I did not stand up, for I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the gypsies, I did not stand up, for I was not a gypsy. When they came for the Jews, well, you know the rest, he said, not wanting to take up more time with the lengthy quote. Finally, they came for the Lutheran minister, but there was no one left to stand up for him, and he ended up in a concentration camp because he didn't think his rights were in danger. Look, a bunch of stumblefuck cops hit the wrong apartment on a bad tip, the skeet shooter said in reply to Fleming's quote. That's a lot different than the military carrying out the direct orders of the chief executive, which is what happened in Germany. Maybe so, but we've done that here in America too. All heads turned towards the young man who was standing by the display case holding a newspaper and a thick hardcover book. Henry Bowman met their gaze, and then the skeet shooter spoke up. That National Guard mess at the college was the same thing. A bunch of trigger-happy cops, not the Army. Interesting you should say that, Sid, Tom Fleming said. As a matter of fact, the National Guard is part of the standing army. They take their orders from the president, and they can, in fact, be sent into combat outside the country, which is why National Guard service qualifies as military service. Fleming smiled at Henry Bowman, but Henry shook his head. I didn't mean Kent State, Henry clarified. I was talking about General Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, and Dwight Eisenhower. Patton and Eisenhower were majors at the time. MacArthur sent the tanks in to drive American war veterans out of Washington. Then he led his troops to where 20,000 unarmed veterans were camped, and he burned them out. He set fire to their camp while they were still in it, and his soldiers shot veterans that resisted. The bonus army, Fleming said softly. Sid the skeet shooter was looking quizzically at both Tom Fleming and the young man that had told the bizarre story about General MacArthur. Henry saw his expression and spent the next 10 minutes explaining about the bonus marchers and what had happened to them. Everyone in the room was shocked, but not surprised. This Balu thing makes me think maybe we should all listen to Mr. Forsyth here, Henry said finally. He was holding up his copy of The Day of the Jackal, which had recently become a national bestseller. Been reading this the last few days, and there's a detailed description of how to procure the birth certificate of someone who died as a child and create a new identity. Yeah, I heard about that, Tom Fleming said. You're right, maybe we should all be out scouring small-town graveyards. Yeah. For a few moments, no one spoke. So how do you know so much about it? Sid asked finally. The bonus army, I mean. My great-uncle was one of them. MacArthur's soldiers broke his arm, and he was badly burned in the fire. Infection set in, and a doctor at a veterans hospital in Pennsylvania cut off his whole arm, but it was too late, and he died a couple of days later. The skeet shooter nodded, then looked around awkwardly. No one much felt like talking anymore. It was Fleming who broke the silence. Tom Fleming, he said, smiling and extending his hand. I've seen you in here before, but I don't think we've met. Are you that guy Bernie's been telling me about who shoots claybirds with an elephant gun? Only when I get lucky, Henry replied with an embarrassed smile. I got to talk to you about this, Fleming said quickly as he stepped over to the counter where Henry was standing. I've run a bunch of training courses for cops, and I'm having real trouble getting them to hit anything that's moving, even if it's 3 feet away and the size of a refrigerator. He began to use his hands to diagram the problem. Now, when you shoot stuff out of the air like that, say it's moving sideways, not away from you, is it better to... By the time their conversation ended 40 minutes later, Tom Fleming and Henry Bowman were good friends. They were also the only two there that day who would remember the short discussion about new identities. August 14th, 1971. Jesus, I hate this sometimes, Henry Bowman thought as his feet pounded the gravel. He had never been more than an average runner, and getting tossed off an overturning hay truck the previous summer and breaking his left leg in 2 places hadn't helped. Told that moron I should drive and he should be up top, Henry thought, remembering the event. With the aid of some surgical steel, Henry's leg had healed without complications, although it still felt a little different than his right one. He had even been able to play rugby this past spring. Every time he did, though, Henry wished he had more speed. It was always frustrating to be unable to catch a rival player that had the ball. Henry doubted that running out to the highway every night during summer break was going to make him much faster, but he hoped his endurance would increase. That would help, and not just on the rugby field. Ought to be able to carry more ammo up the mountains out in Idaho, he told himself as the burning in his lungs increased. Lug the Lottie around better, too. He was approaching the turnoff that led towards a recently constructed subdivision. Henry always took the turn and sprinted the final 500 yards to complete his workout, then walked back home to cool down. When Henry left the main road, the telephone pole that marked the end of his 3-mile run came into view over a quarter-mile off of the highway. Henry commanded his legs to pick up the pace. It was after 11, and traffic in the area was non-existent at that hour. Going out at night was the only way Henry could make himself run regularly during the summer months. Late as it was, the temperature was well over 80 degrees. Henry Bowman's final effort was at a 6-minute mile pace. This was all he could muster, even knowing the end was less than a minute away. The increased wind on his face and chest felt good, but did little to actually cool him off in the August heat. Almost there, slowpoke, he told himself, as sweat filled his eyes and blurred the image of the phone pole less than 100 yards distant. He felt a faint exhilaration in addition to his exhaustion, and was reminded of the punchline to the old joke, "It feels so good when I stop." Henry Bowman wiped the sweat out of his eyes and pumped his arms in the final push, commanding his legs to maintain the sprint that was threatening to make him collapse. "You fucking weenie," he cursed himself silently. Half the guys on the team wouldn't even be breathing hard yet. He pounded out the last few steps, slapped the pole, and forced himself to walk rather than flop down in the gravel. His eyes were squeezed shut, and blood was pounding in his ears, and this was why Henry Bowman did not realize that he was not alone. Henry grunted in alarm as the 4 men hit him almost simultaneously and drove him into the trees beside the road. For the barest instant, Henry thought he was hallucinating, that he was actually in a rugby game. He opened his mouth to yell, but before any sound could come out, he was slammed face first into the trunk of a maple tree. The pain was so great, Henry was certain that his nose had just been broken, though in fact it had not. He collapsed face down in the grass and twigs as one of the men drove a knee between Henry's shoulder blades, forcing air from Henry's lungs and pinning him to the earth. Henry felt that he was suffocating, and he fought off an overpowering urge to vomit. Had he known what was going to happen next, however, he would have encouraged that reflex. Henry felt his gym shorts ripped away, and all of a sudden he realized in absolute horror what was about to happen to him. An image of the ravaged young blonde-haired girl from 3 years before peered unbidden in his mind. He flailed out with his one free arm, but the man on top of him grabbed his wrist easily and twisted his arm until an audible pop signaled that he had dislocated Henry's right shoulder. The man chuckled when it happened. Much later, Henry would decide that it was really the man's laughter that made it so awful, but at that instant the pain was worse than anything Henry Bowman had ever felt in his life. It was several orders of magnitude greater than what he had experienced when they had slid him onto the sheet of plywood out in the alfalfa field the year before, with his leg at a funny angle and an evil-looking bulge at the side of his calf muscle. The combination of pain, physical exhaustion, and lack of oxygen to his brain started to induce unconsciousness in Henry Bowman. "So this is what dying feels like," was Henry's last thought as a blackness began to swallow him whole. "Fuck, I think we killed him," came the coarse whisper as the man on Henry's back jumped off, twisted Henry's head towards him, and peered into his face. "No, still breathing," he said with relief. "This wouldn't kill nobody," one of the others answered. "Just leave 'em a little sore." That got a laugh from all 4 of them. "Let's see if we can wake him up." With that, the man who had made the joke produced an empty beer bottle he had brought along. He held the bottle in position with his left hand and slammed the heel of his right hand into its base. The shock to Henry's system, coupled with the fact that his lungs had been working without restriction for 15 or 20 seconds, brought him abruptly back to consciousness. He started to lift his head and scream involuntarily when his face was slammed into the dirt again, cutting off the sound before it could escape with any volume. The man who had been kneeling on Henry's back laid a hand gently, almost caressingly, on Henry's neck. Then he held the point of a kitchen knife at the back of Henry's jawbone, just below his right ear. "Be still now," the knife man whispered softly, as if to a lover. "Keep them eyes shut tight, and maybe I won't have to cut 'em." "Don't bust the neck of that bottle off inside," one of the others advised. "That wouldn't be no fun." "Tall monster ain't that tough, you got that right," came the happy reply. He gave the bottle a few more whacks and then tossed it aside, noting with satisfaction that the top half of it was bloody. "Who's first?" What seemed to Henry Bowman like an eternity was in fact well under an hour. When he realized that he was not going to lose consciousness again, Henry wished that he would die. After the first man finished and the second started in, Henry knew that wish was not going to come to pass, and the thought of living as a blind man filled him with a despair such as he had never imagined. Soon after that, however, a very strange thing happened. The pain and terror and utter physical helplessness inflicted upon Henry Bowman did not diminish, but his capacity to endure those things increased a tiny bit. It increased just enough that a small part of Henry's mind was able to think of something other than how his insides and his shoulder were screaming as if they were being torn apart. He was able to think of something other than what was being done to him, and something other than how the men might well blind him when they were through. A small part of Henry Bowman's brain was able to focus on a way to fight back and hurt at least one of these men, hurt him and maybe kill him. A spark glowed, and soon that spark ignited like pyrite struck against steel in the presence of dry wood shavings. The small flame became a larger flame, and the larger flame turned into a roaring blaze whose heat and light did not eliminate Henry's pain, but dulled it and made it seem as if it were something that he was watching happen to someone else. Henry Bowman realized that there was one potentially dangerous part of his body over which he still had complete control, and he intended to use it to the fullest extent possible. One of them has to want me to suck him, Henry thought. One of them has to. He willed it with every shred of faith he possessed, and as he did so, Henry worked at controlling the jaw muscles that he had been spasmodically clenching in agony. By thinking of nothing else, Henry found he could open and close his mouth at will. He found he could snap his jaw shut instantly, grind his teeth one side at a time, or slide his jaw sideways with his teeth clenched. For the next 27 minutes, Henry Bowman practiced each of these exercises dozens of times. For 27 minutes, Henry Bowman imagined that he was ignoring his gag reflex, as he did when the doctor stuck a dry tongue depressor down his throat every time he got strep. Only this one won't be dry, he told himself over and over. It'll have my blood on it. Come on, you bastards, one of you has to finish that way. It'll only take me a second to do it. I could clip 6 inches off an axe handle right now. Just one of you, that's all. Please, just one. Henry Bowman was still praying for his chance when the high beams of a 1964 Pontiac Catalina seemed to turn night into day. 19-year-old Jimmy Weir had just dropped his 16-year-old girlfriend Shelley off at her house in time to squeak her under the midnight curfew her father had imposed. Now, he was racing back home before his own father blew a gasket. Jimmy Weir's high beams were on because he had bumped the foot switch while he and Shelley were necking. When the hour had become late, and he had started the car to take her home, Jimmy Weir's mind had been filled with powerful thoughts, but none of them involved roadway etiquette. The big Pontiac had a limited slip differential, and when Jimmy Weir stabbed the throttle, both rear tires broke loose, slewing the tail of the car to the right. David Webb would have stayed on the throttle, given the wheel a touch of opposite lock, let the tires find traction, and powered out of the skid. David Webb, however, was not driving. Jimmy Weir stood on the brakes. The big V8 stalled, and the Catalina came to rest in the center of the road, pointed about 30 degrees left of the direction it had been traveling. Its headlights illuminated an area near where the gang rape was taking place. "Fuck cops!" one of the 4 men exclaimed, logically assuming that any car that slewed to a stop near the scene of a crime with its high beams on had to be trouble. Trees prevented a clear view of them and their actions, but the area was no longer pitch dark. All 4 of them ran. Jimmy Weir was too startled to notice anything that was happening 15 yards off the roadway. He looked frantically around the car, assuring himself that he had not damaged it in some way before turning the key, restarting the engine, and proceeding home at a much more sedate pace. Henry Bowman tried to stand and call for help, but before he could get to his feet, he heard the car drive away. He hoped that his attackers were gone for good, but he knew that there was no assurance of that. Distance was his only real ally now. Something's wrong with my ankle, he realized. Can't use my right arm either. Using his knees and his left arm, Henry Bowman started to crawl towards home.